So, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Expert at Elmwood's virtual speaker series first event this year. I'm delighted to be welcoming our very own Elmwood parent and alumnae, Dr. Meredith Gillespie, this evening. Before I do a formal introduction, just some housekeeping, first of all. Firstly, there are a few people here with virtual backgrounds through Zoom, so I apologize if they turn ghostly at any point, or you hear any dogs barking or children in the background. These things are becoming standard in the lives nowadays as we move into this virtual world we're living in. To introduce Dr. Gillespie, before I do that, I just want to say how grateful we are for her time this evening. We are now in a world and in a life that many of us is new to us, and some of the effects of the pandemic and COVID-19 are really being exacerbated in our classrooms, but also in our homes. And as a parent myself of a daughter and a young boy, I'm seeing differences and changes in them. And tonight, I'm very, very much looking forward to hearing some expert guidance, whilst knowing that obviously the answers are not going to be all given this evening. I am very much looking forward to an expert's opinion on what we're all facing in these changing times. Dr. Gillespie is a clinical psychologist with Boomerang Health. Now, this is a clinic that is affiliated with Sick Kids. Many of you will know or have heard of Sick Kids, as they have been very heavily involved in many ministry policies, and particularly as we were going into COVID-19, they were informing and helping, I know, the Ministry of Health in terms of the decisions they were making. She earned her doctorate in School Applied Child Psychology from McGill University, as well as a Master's of Arts Educational Psychology from McGill University, and a Bachelor of Arts Honours from Queen's University. Meredith is an Elmwood parent and a proud alumnae, having graduated as the head girl of the class of 1999. It is my absolute privilege and pleasure to welcome you, Meredith, for this evening, and we very much look forward to hearing your views and opinions for the next hour. Just before we get started, there's one more thing from me. You'll notice a Q&A button on your screens. We are aiming to answer questions at the end of the presentation. So if you pop your questions into the Q&A, we will look to answer them at the end of the session. So without further ado or introduction, welcome Dr. Gillespie. Over to you.
Hello. It's so nice to be here. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. This is something, anxiety is definitely something that I've had a lot of experience working with. And I thought that, as a parent, as a graduate of Elmwood, I tried to frame this presentation tonight with a lot of experience, clinical and personal, in mind. As you've already heard, I did graduate from Elmwood in the class of 99, which doesn't seem as long as it actually is. And as a clinical child psychologist, I provide assessment services and treatment services to children, adolescents, and their families. Before moving to Ottawa, which just happened in the last couple of months, I was the former psychology team lead at Boomerang Health, powered by Sick Kids. And a lot of my work there focused on helping children and teens through different challenges related to anxiety and depression and just their overall adjustment. And I think, supporting kids through COVID-19, there's a lot of overlap with what we already know about anxiety and depression, and there's some new information that I think parents can really benefit from. So tonight, I'm going to be starting off the talk by talking about anxiety and what that looks like for teenagers. Then we're going to talk a little bit about loss and grief and what that looks like now that we're dealing with COVID-19. And maybe not in the way we tend to think about it, but in sort of new and innovative ways. We're going to talk about COVID-19 and how that can amplify anxiety. And then we're going to shift gears and talk more about different parenting strategies that can be helpful. And these strategies are informed by what we know is helpful with anxiety, what we know is helpful with loss and grief, and just taking into consideration this unusual sort of potentially traumatic time that a lot of kids are experiencing right now. And in the end, we'll leave some time for questions and answers. So we'll start with anxiety. Now, I have to say, I tried to pick pictures for this workshop, for this PowerPoint, that didn't look dire. This one was a good one. I like this one a lot. When you look up anxiety in teens and you try to Google an image, it's always kids on the ground with their head in their hands, crying. And I don't think that's necessarily what it always looks like. So I've tried to choose photos that potentially look a little bit more relatable. So what is anxiety? So we know that anxiety is a normal human emotion. It motivates us to solve problems and to take productive action. It's very helpful. It's required for our survival because it directs our attention to actual threats in our environment. We know that when our amygdala detects danger, it sends messages that requires your body to react to it. And the reaction that ensues is the fight or flight or freeze response. So we talk about fight or flight, but we can include freeze in there as well, because we not only have to be ready for action or we have to be able to run away, but sometimes it's very healthy and important that we just sort of stop what we're doing and just freeze. Over time, as you experience these dangers in your daily life, you learn safety behaviors that keep you from. So anxiety is all driving that experience, and it's important for our body to detect where real danger is and be able to discriminate between what is real and what is unreal or unrealistic. We know that when it comes to anxiety can be helpful or it can be unhelpful. So it's quite normal from time to time that we might get preoccupied by things that we don't have control over and we can't predict. I've seen many kids who worry about roller coasters. I see many kids that worry about intense weather. But as long as those types of worries aren't showing up every day, that's fine. That's normal, that's appropriate. But sometimes this worry shifts into high gear. It gets too big, too fast, and it makes things seem hard or even impossible. So I like to think about that like an alarm system that tends to go off no matter what is going on in your house. If it's ultra sensitive, it's picking up the spider walking over the sensor. It may be going off for absolutely no reason. So it's always sending out these false alarms. These false alarms are going off unexpectedly. They keep getting triggered by clear or specific dangers. And as these false alarms are going off, we're constantly having to try to protect ourselves over and over again. These safety behaviors that we use to try to keep ourselves safe, even when there's no real threat, start to turn into a habit, and they get in the way of just our daily functioning. Worry likes to take over, and worry likes to take advantage of the alarm system. So what ends up happening when we're fighting or freezing is that our thinking is compromised. It's very difficult to think logically if we're anticipating a threat in our environment. So what ends up happening is when you're experiencing a strong worry or a preoccupying worry, you tend to be prone to making these all or nothing thinking mistakes. Those thinking mistakes have you thinking about things in black or white terms. So you may be exaggerating the likelihood of something bad happening. This is definitely going to happen. You may be thinking that if it does happen, it would be a catastrophe. Everything will go wrong if this thing happens to me. And you tend to underestimate your ability to handle it. This will be a disaster, and I don't know if I'm going to get back on my feet. Is our body reacting to anxiety, and we feel it in terms of our heart rate, our breathing. We might have racing thoughts. We're also making mistakes in how we're interpreting these threats that are around us, in that we may be picking up on threats, or we may be amplifying what the threat is in terms of how we're evaluating the Where does anxiety come from? It can be triggered by a specific event or life stress. So we know that many young people experience what we call adverse childhood events, ACEs. So that could be a death of a parent, that could be violence within the home, that could be challenges at school or in their neighborhood. So we know that those particular stresses, especially early on in life, can have a very specific impact on kids in terms of their mental health. We also know that anxiety runs in families. So there's a lot of research that talks about the heritability of anxiety. Those who have a diagnosis of an anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, may have a greater potential of sort of passing that down to their kids. We also know that some of us are born with temperamental differences. So we may react very strongly to threats in our environment or changes in our environment. The baby that doesn't like to be held or needs to be soothed in a certain way. The kid that needs to have extra time to warm up. Those behavioral inhibition characteristics may, in some cases, predispose somebody to developing anxiety. We also know that there are environmental risk factors for anxiety. So you could take somebody who is not particularly anxious, has not experienced any adverse life events, does not have a family member with anxiety, but you could place them in a circumstance where the way other people are acting and are coping, or the way other people are talking about things, the messaging that's being sent, those types of environmental characteristics could lead a person to developing anxiety. So we know that there's a nature piece, there's a nurture piece. Now, the reason why anxiety is something that I deal with quite a bit in my practice is because nearly 1 in 3 adolescents will meet the criteria for an anxiety disorder by the age of 18. That's 1 in 3. That's 1/3 of teenagers will meet criteria for an anxiety disorder, which that you have to meet certain criteria in order for that to be as significant and worthy of diagnosis. There are, certain anxiety disorders that are more prevalent than others, and there are some that are more prevalent at different stages in the lifespan. So younger children may have more separation anxiety, whereas older teens will potentially experience more social anxiety. After puberty, we know that where boys will have had more prevalence of anxiety and panic than girls, after puberty, girls start to show a greater prevalence of anxiety. We also know that girls are more likely to experience, adolescent girls are more likely to experience depression, and anxiety and depression tend to go hand in hand. So one of the things that as psychologists we notice a lot are that anxiety, the rates of anxiety, the referrals we get for anxiety, those tend to be going up, and those were going up pre-COVID. And a lot of people have looked into why that might be the case. And while nobody knows for sure, it's very difficult to be able to sort of identify the causation of some of these patterns that we're seeing. We do have some hypotheses as to why anxiety is going up. We know that teens right now are under a lot of pressure to succeed. And one of the things that is particularly relevant is that youth that are coming from more economically advantaged backgrounds, those where their families are more affluent, tend to have higher rates of depression and anxiety and substance use than youth from more economically disadvantaged households. And one of the main risk factors that have been identified is that there is this pressure to achieve. I can, therefore I must. And what happens when you're kind of surrounded by that type of messaging, it may not be explicit, but maybe more implicit, is that if you don't achieve, you feel inadequate and you live in a state of fear of not achieving. We also know that the world feels scarier and more threatening. We don't really need to get into details about why that's the case, but I think that there's a general consensus that we do generally feel that way. We are barraged by negative information in the news, again, pre-COVID. And kids are much more aware of what's going on, and they're hearing about things that are happening, but a lot of other things seem to be happening that can make kids feel a lot less secure in their safe environments. And then we also think about the negative impact of social media, how teens are very likely to be looking at social media and comparing themselves to what they see. And when we compare ourselves to ridiculous models and inspiration, it affects how we see ourselves and how we evaluate ourselves. Now, what are some signs of anxiety in teens? These are things that you may have noticed. These are things to be on the lookout for. Kids that have anxiety, teens who have anxiety tend to seek out a lot of reassurance. They need to know that they're doing a good job. They're checking to make sure everything's right. So questions around, do you think I did a good job? Do you like this? Is this a nice outfit? I mean, sometimes those are perfectly appropriate questions, but when they're happening on a regular basis, and it seems like the teen is unable to feel comfortable and confident in their own decision without asking for those types of, that type of feedback from you, that's concerning. We also will see that teens who are anxious will react really strongly and often with anger to things that seem relatively inconsequential. So for example, you might take your teen to Starbucks drive-through, they're in their pajamas, it's not a big deal, but after you decide that you'd like to stop in and grab something at the grocery store and your teen reacts so strongly, no, I'm not going in, there's no way, I don't want to do that, you didn't tell me we were going to go. You might think, wow, they're in a really bad mood, what's happening? And that could be it. They could just be in a really bad mood and want to go home. But I would wonder, maybe they aren't dressed appropriately and they're quite worried about who might see them at the grocery store. This wasn't something that they had planned. They didn't get to modify what they're wearing. And now they're thinking about the social impact of showing up at the grocery store and being seen with their parent wearing their pajamas. We'll also see signs of anxiety in terms of fears of making mistakes and perfectionistic types of behavior. So not every high achieving teen is a perfectionist, nor do they necessarily fear mistakes. But often when you start to hear kids talking in all or nothing terms about how they have to do well, if they don't get this mark, then this terrible thing might happen. Their dreams of going on to this university or not being able to do something. When we're thinking about things in only those extremes, that can be very concerning. Teens who are anxious will often also express having sort of physical aches and pains on a more consistent basis. So they may be reporting more headaches, more stomach aches, not feeling well, needing to sort of stop something and move out of the activity, wanting to go home because they're not feeling great. Avoidance. So sometimes those physical symptoms are also part of that avoidance. So not wanting to do things that they once were able to do. And often they'll say, oh, I don't really feel like doing, or that's boring. But really, when you get into it, you realize that there's something that's actually quite concerning about how they're seeing this activity. And they no longer want to participate in it because they're worried about something happening to them, or potentially the social outcome, or the risk of failure. Anxious teens tend to have sleep problems, trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. And sleep can be really tricky to investigate with teens because they all sleep at weird times and stay up quite late. But when you start to notice changes in sleep, despite the fact that they seem to be trying to maintain the right sleep schedule, that can be problematic. And then finally, if your teen is showing very rigid habits that can't be broken. So it almost seems like they're being a bit, what's the term? I can't think about it. But essentially they've got these rituals that they have to pursue. Maybe the ritual is a checking ritual, or needing to get dressed in a certain way, or to touch something, or they start to get quite selective about how they do things. And if you break that, or you ask them to do it differently, they have a really strong reaction. One of the things I want everyone to keep in mind is that a teenager who's been anxious since childhood will potentially have a lifestyle that's been built around her anxieties. So she may choose to only do activities that she's good at. She may have certain ways of doing things that the family has just adjusted to because that's the way they work best for her. But I'm hoping that as we're sort of talking through some of these issues, we can start to kind of consider and reflect on the fact that sometimes the teenager who seems to be keeping it all together quite well has actually just made sure and determined what they can and cannot do and is living in quite a rigid sort of box of existence. So now we transition over to loss and grief. Often when we think of grief, we think of it as stemming from the death of a person or an animal. But I think we can think of it in much broader terms. It can be understood as resulting from any significant loss. And I want to introduce another term, which is disenfranchised grief, which is grief that results from a loss that is not accepted or recognized by society or by your family as significant. And the reason I think of that particular term is that COVID has brought with it a tremendous number of losses. Not only an extensive loss of life throughout the country and the world, but there's also losses in our daily lives, and particularly for teenagers, that sometimes we may not recognize as being as significant or as impactful as we should. So off the top of my head, here are some losses that I came up with. So the loss of school and academic engagement. Definitely that was something that we noticed at the beginning of the pandemic. And who's to say whether or not we'll see that again? Depending on where people are living, that may be another thing to keep in mind. Loss of sports and extracurriculars. So, team sports, musical theater, music, singing, depending on the types of things that kids were doing because they love them and they were good at them outside of the school environment or even within the school environment, they're not able to do those things anymore. And that can lead to a loss of identity. So who am I when I can't do the things that I'm really good at? I was the athletic kid. I was the kid that was on every team. I was the kid that was creative, and I was going to run this gallery, and I was going to do this. And now we can't do that anymore. So how am I going to figure out what I'm good at now? There can be a loss of a sense of belonging due to the distancing and isolation that's come from COVID. And I think about that in terms of, some of the different rules now that different parents may allow some kids to get together and other kids may not feel comfortable getting together with groups, knowing what some of the guidelines are in our city. And so now kids are feeling left out if they're not participating. And they may feel like their social credibility is on the line because it's not clear how people should spend time together and, what's okay and what's not okay. There's also a loss of relationships. So some people are just not seeing each other anymore. And there are fewer opportunities to expand relationships. And with teenagers, I think about romantic relationships and what that must be like, because it's not as easy to meet people or to spend time with people, especially if they're not within your classroom environment. There's the loss of independence, which, as we know, during adolescence is particularly critical. And there are loss of certain hopes and dreams and celebrations. So, starting high school was a really big deal. Graduating high school was a really big deal. Birthdays, obviously weddings and anniversaries and things like that, but even smaller things in terms of, I was looking forward to this tournament or I was looking forward to this big production. And then, as we know is particularly important to anxiety, there's been a loss of predictability and control. So we don't know what's going to happen, and we don't know how long we're going to be doing this for. Grief in children. So when we think about the results of loss, grief in children and teens isn't always easily identifiable. So you may not even realize that your child has experienced loss. It can look like anxiety. It can result in anxiety. It can look like anger with kids sort of pushing you away and pulling you in. It can also have the qualities of those same physical complaints, lack of focus, so attention problems, nightmares, sleep issues, and sort of regressive behavior where your previously very independent young woman now doesn't want to sleep on their own, or doesn't want to leave the house, or doesn't seem to feel like they can do what they used to be able to do. What we know in terms of grief, though, is that there's no right way to grieve a loss. Young people don't always grieve the way we expect them to, which makes it quite confusing. They may sort of seem in one moment like they really want to process what they're experiencing, and then all of a sudden they don't want to talk about it anymore, and that can be very confusing. But there's also no time limit. And so while they may have dealt with the specific loss, or they seem to be dealing with it quite well in the moment, where they weren't able to play on the soccer team and now the season's done, so they must have moved on, the impact of that loss may ebb and flow over time. So they may have dealt with it pretty well in the short term, but later on, while they're getting to the end of the school year, they may sort of say, wow, that was really a huge thing that I really missed out on, and that would have made a huge difference to how I feel about myself, or I don't have anything going on in my life now. Look, soccer's gone too. So when we think of the losses of around anxiety, around COVID, we can also think about the anxiety that stems from COVID. So we know that COVID-19 has impacted mental health overall by amplifying the inequalities that already existed. So those who are already struggling in all the domains of functioning are likely, those weaknesses or those challenges are likely amplified as a result of COVID-19. We also know that any of the supports that were in place pre-COVID are either scaled back or absent. So schools are maybe open, but the some of the extra programs that would have been available to support kids who needed that extra time or tutoring may not be available. Some of the social programs, just treatment programs in the community, group programs, art programs, those aren't running in the same way. So the things that a lot of us might have relied on to sort of buffer the impact of other adverse life events in children's lives may not be present anymore. We know that our safety feels threatened. So where our alarm system, if we're anxious, our alarm system may be going off from faulty alarms. This isn't faulty. This is not a false alarm. This is a real threat. And so that fight, flight, or freeze response is very appropriate in this scenario. Parents are under increased stress, and families are spending more time together. So we know that a parent's capacity to cope is linked to how their child is functioning. So when parents are stressed, and I would say that at the beginning of COVID, I noticed the impact on parents quite pronounced, in a pronounced way, maybe more so than the impact on kids at that point. But when parents are stressed, their kids pick up on that. And when families are spending all of their time together, there really isn't any sort of boundaries in terms of compartmentalizing our work and life balance. Sometimes we haven't spent this much time with our kids, so we haven't really had to communicate in the way that we now do. And that's very challenging. And finally, our screens are life. So we're living a lot online. And that's something that, we've always been a bit wary of, and now we're having to depend on it. When you think about some of the reasons that we know anxiety is escalating, and you think about them in the context of COVID, I think they're particularly related. So we know that anxiety may ensue when kids have a high pressure to succeed on them, and they have high expectations. Well, now with these interesting sort of virtual school options and fewer extracurriculars, the rules are different and the game has changed. So for kids that were doing really well academically before and kind of knew how to get through and be successful, that may not work quite the same way anymore. We also know that the world feels scary and threatening. So it is. Our health is potentially threatened by every decision we make when we leave our house. And that's not necessarily to make people feel more uncomfortable, but it is something we think about every time we put our mask on, every time we go into a store. So what we may have used to keep ourselves safe before, we may have had to amp that up and it's going to become more ingrained and more relied on. And then we think about the impact of social media, and we have a generation of teens and kids and their parents who now are almost reliant on that on a daily basis. That's the only way we know how to connect with others is online. And so when you think about those as being risk factors for anxiety, those also become particularly relevant during COVID. But there's also some other things to consider. And I don't know necessarily how this is going to all play out over time. We know that sleep has increased for teens, and sleep is particularly important for teens. They need it. And there's been more time for sleeping, probably because there's more time for a lot of things that, we haven't necessarily always prioritized. Some positive family time may have increased. So, where families are under increased stress, there may be opportunities to spend time together, which has really been positive. And so some siblings may be forging relationships. Some parent-child time may be happening that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And so that may have a very positive impact on children's well-being as well. Some social stresses may have shifted or been reduced in that, with any sort of relational aggression or any challenges for girls in terms of how they were navigating the social atmosphere in high school, either over the summer or in person in school, those things changed. And I know a lot of teens were doing quite well early on in the pandemic when they didn't have to deal with the drama anymore. And there was a really great reason to not be chatting and seeing people. Now, as we return back to school, that may have changed a little bit, but also now there may not be the same expectation that people are showing up at activities and events together. And I know some teens have been very happy that they can say, oh, I'm not allowed to go because of COVID. They've been finding it a really nice sort of excuse to not have to show up and be present at things they don't really want to go to. There's also some research to suggest that while screen use has gone up, screens are being used differently. So where before we were concerned about how screens were used because kids would just be scrolling and watching videos and just sort of just checking out when they were online, now they're actually using it to connect with other people. And that quality of the screen use becomes very important. And so that's something to really consider as well. Yes, my kid is spending a lot of time online and on a screen, but how are they spending time and who are they connecting with? And maybe that's actually really protective. And the last thing that I would say is that because of COVID, we've been given permission to let people know how we feel and how we're doing. And so there's a lot of people who pre-COVID may not have felt that they could ask for help. There's a lot of teens who pre-COVID felt like they were just getting by, but by all intents and purposes looked sort of fine. And so now everyone's much more acutely aware of the potential impact of COVID. And so they're talking about things in a different way. And so they've sort of been given permission to share the areas in which they're struggling. And I think that's actually quite positive. So now where do we go? So we've talked a little bit about anxiety. I've discussed sort of what anxiety is, how it's a bit of a faulty alarm system. And that in combination with that all or nothing thinking can lead us to using these safety behaviors in order to avoid anxiety producing scenarios or to cope with it, but in very rigid ways. We've talked about COVID-19 and loss and how it's important to recognize the significant losses that can't be fixed or replaced for teens. And so part of that may be helping teens grieve what they've lost. And we've just talked about COVID-19 and anxiety, how COVID is really a real threat, which means that anxiety, that alarm system is going off for real this time. We know that it amplifies issues that are already present, and it adds significant stress within the individual and within the family. But not on the bright side, but as another consideration, we also know that we have permission to ask for support to build those coping and parenting skills. Now, we always had permission to, but many of us feel like now it's appropriate, and there's the stigma around asking for help and talking about some of these issues, and for teens as well, is removed. So what do we know is helpful for anxiety and could be helpful for any sort of teen experiencing anxiety related to COVID or other things, and what is not helpful. So one of the things we know about anxiety is that anxiety would love for you to have some way of getting out of the situation that you're in. But as parents, we can't swoop in and be a superhero. We have to understand that our kids need to have opportunities to practice new skills in order to build them into their repertoire. So if our kid is stressed about a test, we can't let them stay home. That's avoidance. If our kid is concerned about having to order at Starbucks because they don't like talking in person in new, unfamiliar scenarios, we can't order for them. We have to find ways to help them feel more comfortable trying out the skills that they probably have, but they just don't use very much. We also have to make sure that we don't fall into the reassurance trap. So when kids say, "What do you think? Is this going to happen? Can you tell me it's going to be okay?" It sounds a bit harsh, but one of the things that I coach parents to do is say, it doesn't matter what I think. What do you think? How do you feel about this? We want to support girls in thinking realistically about the actual potential outcomes of certain decisions. So when kids are saying, if I think I'm going to fail this test, well, what else could be true? Well, maybe I won't fail the test. Or, I think I'm going to fail this test, and if I do, I'm not going to get a good mark in this class, and then I'm not going to be able to get into, medical school. Well, what's happened when you worried about this before? Really asking kids to find ways to sort of maybe think about the thing that worry is not telling them. What else is true? What are other facts that maybe are the worry is not letting us access? We don't want to give them those answers, but we can coach them into thinking about it from a different perspective, the perspective that worry is not giving them. Just like not being a superhero, we don't want to enable avoidance. So often, we see how stressed something is making our child. And so we try to find ways to fix it or make it less challenging. Now, finding ways to make it less challenging could be really helpful as long as the goal is still the same, that this child or this teen is going to be able to do the thing that they need to do on their own eventually. So we want to help kids sort of break things down into smaller steps. But we also want to make sure that we're allowing her to embrace discomfort. So all the time when we're working on anxiety, it's not about living without anxiety. It's being able to cope with the discomfort that anxiety brings. We can't always know exactly what's going to happen, but we have to be able to sit in that feeling and recognize that we can handle it, even if it's not clear what the end game is going to be. Some other lessons from working with kids with anxiety and teens with anxiety is that sleep really matters. That's probably one of the most important things, that everything is worse when you don't sleep. And so sleep hygiene is often one of the first things that I work on with families and teens. What do your routines look like? When did the screens go off? I mean, screens are great for connecting with friends, but there needs to be some real boundaries around where they are. Are they in your room? What is it? How long? And what is the practice of sort of unplugging in the evening? We know that kids need a lot of sleep. Teens particularly need a great deal of sleep. And so how can we facilitate having some really healthy sleep schedule and sleep routines? We also know that parents need to be on the same page. And what happens with kids when they're anxious is that often we'll find that one parent is very kind of harsh or minimizing of it, like, "Oh, it's not a big deal, don't worry about it." And so another parent will often take on more of that protective role. So the other parent might say, wow, I don't really think that's fair. They're really struggling. So I'm going to try to make this better for them. And so that parent tries to sort of over-identify with the child and tries to make things easier. And so you've got these two competing ways of parenting, and they end up just pushing each other into more extreme stances. So the more one parent is seeing that the other parent is easygoing and permissive, the other parent feels like they have to get harsher and more minimizing. So anxiety will take advantage of that. Anxiety will take advantage of the fact that, mom may be letting me stay home from school and dad is not letting me talk about my feelings. That's a bit of a stereotype, but that's often what we see. So we need to find ways to get parents on the same page so that they can both be responding in the same way. It's not about letting the kid not try something because they're anxious, but it's also not helpful to minimize what their experience is. We need a kind of a combination of sort of firm limits around what is expected and how we're going to do it and how we're going to be there and help you, and being attuned emotionally to what that kid is experiencing, but not over attuned so that the parent themselves is feeling the same level of anxiety as the teen. When you see that we have parents on different ends of the spectrum in terms of helping kids cope, what I always try to get parents to do is reflect on their own thinking traps and their own coping skills. We know that anxiety runs in families. We know we all have our ways of coping, some helpful and unhelpful. And what I always say to parents is you can't expect her to do what you haven't been able to do. So while you may want your daughter to work on their perfectionistic tendencies, or you may want your daughter to feel more comfortable making mistakes, you really have to find ways to be comfortable making mistakes as well. And so sometimes working on anxiety in the family is having everyone work on anxiety in their own ways. So I'll ask parents, to share their own experiences of anxiety with their teens, talking about the way they used to think about things and the things that they realized maybe didn't need to be seen in such black or white terms. And so we want to make sure that parents are modeling healthy ways of coping with emotions. And that is a particularly important thing during COVID, as in some cases, parents are showing their kids emotions in ways that they've never shown them before. And so we need to make sure as parents that we're taking care of ourselves, that we're talking about how we're feeling. We're looking for ways when we are feeling uncomfortable to sort of deal with those emotions in positive ways. And even just modeling seeking out help can be helpful for kids to see, because then they realize that it's okay to ask other people to support you when you're struggling. That sense of vulnerability is a really important thing for kids to recognize in other people, because it's not great showing other people our vulnerable sides. As parents, I think it's really important, if we're going to be emotionally attuned, to offer chances to talk to kids, but not forcing it. So sometimes we want to talk about things and they don't want to talk about it. That's not the time. So, you have to be comfortable with the fact that just because it's not, the time that just because you want to talk about it doesn't mean that they necessarily want to. But what you'll find is that when some of those emotional things start to be brought to the surface, when kids do want to talk about a challenging thing, you may not find that to be a very helpful time. It may be a little bit inconvenient. And I call that the emotional light switch. Often kids are bringing their emotions to us. It could be during some sort of conflict. It could have just get out the door, or you're trying to get back to work, or you need to do something else. But that's when some of this stuff comes out. And we try to flick the emotional light switch. We try to turn it off because it's really not a great time. But we have to take advantage of those moments. We have to try to interpret what they're trying to tell us. We need to help them acknowledge what it is and validate it. And so that does, with anxiety in particular, that we give in to the emotion, but we tell them that we see it that we hear it, that we can feel it for them. It's okay if we can't fix it. It's okay if we can't solve the problem. But I recognize how you feel. That is sort of the really, really critical thing, because when we validated that to a teenager, they don't have to show it to us in the same way anymore. The other important thing is that when teens bring things to you, you don't necessarily try to look for a bright side. You don't try to get them to think about it differently in that moment. It's a little bit different than when things are anxiety producing. That is a really helpful thing to help them sort of think realistically. But if kids are just talking about a really challenging thing that happened, or the loss of the sports team experience, or their concerns about graduating and not getting a big party, we don't have to come up with a solution in that moment. That isn't necessarily why they're talking to you. They want you to understand what they're going through. And often we sometimes will feel like we need to come up with some solution or a way of figuring out a silver lining. And that's not necessary. In fact, being able to cope with negative emotions is really, really important. And having someone to be able to sit in those emotions with us is even more important. As we parent through COVID, we need to focus on creating meaning and connection. So how do we celebrate the thing that we lost? How do we keep the things we've lost with us? So that's not necessarily about finding the bright side to the loss, because that's not the point. It's even though we can't do things the same way, we don't just move on from it. We don't act like it never happened. We don't act like we didn't care about it. It's when the time is right and when we feel comfortable, how can we go back and do something? How can we take action? How can we celebrate this thing, even if it's not the same, but we can really acknowledge and validate the important thing that we feel, didn't get to happen. It's also really important that kids feel like they have a purpose. And so finding opportunities to give them to sort of take action in their communities, to do things for other people, that really shifts kind of how they see themselves and how they experience some deep losses and big traumatic events. We have to be really aware of their struggle for independence during a time of increased vulnerability. So for teenagers in particular, this is not the time where they should be sitting at home with us every single night and hanging out with us every single hour. We really do want to foster a sense of going out into the world and identity, what they love, what their career could be, what they feel that they're good at. So how can we do that? What has not changed because of COVID? And how can we take advantage of that? How can I let my daughter take control of her schedule? What things can I hand over to her? Because everything else feels like it's very much determined by COVID. We also want to consider post-traumatic growth. So post-traumatic growth is a change that's initiated by a loss that person comes to appreciate about themselves. So again, this isn't the kind of thing just to sort of, you can't foster that or tell a kid how to, look at things differently, but it's a process. And you want to find ways to provide opportunities for her to build on her own self-reflective skills. So all of us are having to adapt so demonstrably during COVID. But one of the things that we can really impart on our daughters is that ability to sort of sit back and recognize what we need, what we wish we could do, what we're good at, and things that we really feel that we want to change, because we have all the time in the world essentially, but we also have the ability to see ourselves separate from some of the other institutions that we're usually part of, the friends that we're always part of. This is giving us some really interesting opportunities to just reflect on what we want and what we feel. And I think that that's a very important sort of process that parents can be facilitating during this very strange time. The last thing that I want to talk about before we open it up to questions is some of the research on resilience. And we often will think about resilience as something that people have inherently in themselves. And often the way we talk about resilience is all about sort of personal attributes, like the strength of the person, the strength of the child. The research on resilience is not that. Resilience is really strongly rooted in our relationships. Resilience is not about inserting more positive experiences. Like if something bad happens, we're going to make it better by doing fun things. I'm going to try to make sure that they get to see all of their friends this week because they had a really bad day yesterday. That can be helpful, but it's really about finding opportunities to maintain structure and routine in our lives. It's about making sure we maintain the connections to the institutions and individuals that keep us afloat. Those relationships and those associations we have really matter. So it's not about, I'm going to boost someone's mental health by providing fun activities. It's really about trying to maintain the status quo, trying to do things with some structure and routine and familiarity and consistency, but also making sure that that individual feels supported by the people that are around them. We also know that altruism, doing things for other people, is linked to better well-being. So when an individual feels that they can give back in their own community, in their own family, within their own region, that gives them a sense of purpose, and that helps them become more resilient. It's also very important that most human growth happens in the hardest circumstances. So while we won't know for sure how we're all doing until we can look back at this time with some distance, I think it is important that that we recognize that none of us will be quite the same after this experience. Some of that we won't be able to fix. There may be things that we can postpone. There may be things that we will be able to sort of muddle through. But how we cope in this scenario will be helpful in that we will be able to look back, and our daughters will be able to look back at this time and say, I got through this. And how we process that and how we make meaning from that and how we recall that in terms of the things that remained the same, the people we felt connected to, the activities and the self-care that we recognized were helpful for us, that will be particularly impactful. All right.
Thank you so much, Meredith. Wow, I think probably everyone was like me. I was jotting down all kinds of ideas and thinking and making connections to school and to personal life. And so this was a really rich session full of takeaways and strategies. I really enjoyed how you made the point that it's okay if as a parent you can't fix it. I know as parents, we so often feel that we have to fix everything. And to hear you say that it's okay to listen and not have the solution and not to feel that we always have to be able to fix the problem. And that even sometimes it's more helpful to not present that bright side. I know sometimes that's definitely my default, to always try to come up with the cheery bright side, which then always falls flat. So now I know why. So thank you so much for all of your insights and expertise, and the manner that you shared them with us was so open and welcoming. And I know it definitely resonated with me, as I said, thinking about our students and the girls at school, and also thinking about personally everything that everyone is going through and dealing with. And so how our current situation that we're in has maybe exacerbated some things, but I really appreciated how you pointed out too that there can be some areas where there's a positive knock-on effect. So that was really nice to hear. We do have a few questions that have either come through personally to me in the chat or have been shared in the Q&A. So I have one question around social media. And you did mention that during COVID, you know, the girls are spending more time on their screens, and in some cases it's connecting, as you said, making connections with friends, or potentially it's school related things. But definitely knowing that, as you mentioned, some of their time on social media is not necessarily positive. And so knowing that they are on their screens more, are there things that we as parents should be doing? I know parents often ask about, you know, monitoring what they're doing or what they're spending their time on. How much should parents be getting involved in that? What are some strategies with mitigating some of the more negative effects of the time they may be spending on social media?
Yeah, so I mean, social media screen time, that could be an entire workshop in itself. I think the tricky part about it is that, you know, especially during COVID, it's sort of, we're all in the same storm, but we're all in different boats. So different kids need different things from it. And not all kids are getting the same thing from the same thing. So I can make that even clearer. So I love social media. I really enjoy it. I love looking at celebrity gossip magazines online. I'm sure that that would just that's not great for my mental health. I shouldn't be looking at celebrity lives and wondering about, you know, what's happening in their relationships and their clothes. I find it really relaxing because I don't think it's very important, but I find it entertaining. So sometimes it's hard for us to judge just based on what we're looking at or how we're spending our time, whether that is sort of unhelpful or helpful or appropriate or inappropriate sorts of screen time. So, I mean, the thing that the research is sort of supporting right now is that the use for connection is really critical. And, you know, we can't throw all screen time or all social media into the same bucket with everything else. So, you know, I don't entirely understand TikTok, but I know a lot of kids love it because they love posting videos and trying to replicate things. And that makes them feel part of a community. As an adult, I might see that and say, that's sort of brainless. And I'm not really sure that's a great use of your time. But that makes them feel like they're part of something bigger. And I would say, based on my presentation, that feeling like you're part of something bigger is great. So, you know, there is the privacy component. Obviously, we want kids to be safe online. We don't want them, you know, hooking up with strangers. That's obviously within the purview of parents. At the same time, we have to really, you know, make sure that kids feel like they have a sense of independence. And so if online is the only place where they feel like they can escape from their families for a little bit, and it's the only place they feel like they can forge relationships with people, then we kind of have to let them do that. So it's very hard to kind of provide clear guidelines that sort of fit each family or each developmental stage. I mean, girls who are in middle school are quite different than girls that are in the junior school, which are quite different than girls that are about to graduate. I think the best thing that parents can do is ask their kids to teach them about it. You know, sit down and say, okay, tell me about this game you're playing. Tell me about this. How does this work? Can I make a video with you? Am I mortifying? You know, is this something that I can understand? What would this be similar to when I was younger? Show me how this works. Who are you talking to? Maybe they won't tell you, but you can try. You can ask. You can see. But, you know, I think just having some openness about it so it doesn't have to be something that they're feeling like they have to keep from you, but also providing them enough respect and autonomy to make some decisions, I think is really important. So I'm happy to come back and we can talk about it, but it is a really complicated issue, and I can understand why parents struggle with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Those are really helpful and practical ideas in terms of kind of how as a parent you approach those conversations. You mentioned the idea of humanizing anxiety, and that you know, parents can be open with their children about maybe how they've experienced anxiety in their own lives. And I just wonder, we have a question in the chat about how to what degree does a parent share? Is there a line? Is there a point at which, you don't kind of go into too much detail? Is there ever kind of too much sharing? Maybe your own feelings about anxiety. Is there, do you kind of at some point need to keep certain things private? That's a question that somebody's asked.
Yeah, I mean yeah, of course. So, I would only want to share what you feel comfortable sharing. I would say, filtering that for the age of the person you're talking to. I also will coach parents to share certain aspects of what they've experienced in terms of anxiety, but, try to not make it about the child. So, you can talk about fears around maybe things that seem a little bit more neutral, but if it has anything to do with like marital relationships, dating relationships, your physical health, safety, if you have information around, potential threats to safety, and that's something you worry about, you don't want to necessarily bring that up or amplify what the child is already feeling. But, other areas that you might be worried about, when I think of phobias, for example, heights, mice, lightning, tornadoes, mistakes is often one that a lot of us do struggle with. So I will coach parents, like when I think about the Starbucks example where, the child can't order for themselves. I have asked parents, where one parent hates making mistakes and the other one has some social anxiety, and they know me quite well and we have a good relationship and everyone's on board and we're being collaborative. So we know that the child has to practice talking, but the parent also has to practice making mistakes. So we'll ask that, the child can be in the back seat, be quiet, doesn't have to talk that time. They do like 2 rounds through the drive-through. One time the child will order, the other time the parent will order, but have to correct their order 3 times. And so the child is able to see that it is not easy to do the things that sometimes people are asking them to do, but that their parent can get through it too. And I think it's a really nice experience that, that the child is obviously not therapizing their parent, but that they can experience together what it's like to have to face your fears. And so sometimes that can be really helpful. So those types of, slightly less cumbersome anxieties can, I think, be very shared in a fun and playful way.
That's a great idea. Thank you. I just want to remind our participants, our attendees, that you can post any questions that you have either in the chat or in the Q&A, whichever one is more accessible to you. I am checking both of those areas. If you send it in the chat and send it to the panelists, then I'm seeing it there. And then if it's in the Q&A, everyone will also see your question there. One of the questions that has come through is around the milestones. You talked about the grief and the loss, and definitely some of the girls, all of them in different ways, some more obvious milestones than others, those opportunities that create sadness around the loss. And I guess 2 questions that are coming up. One is around how do we find out what those milestones mean to the girls versus maybe the meaning that we attribute to them? And also, what is the best way to help the girls deal with the sadness of the loss?
So I think that's a really important point that you just made, Megan, that sometimes we attribute more significance to certain things than the girls actually have. And the things that they think are significant, we didn't even consider. And so, it's not always easy, and sometimes we make mistakes. You can ask questions about it. You can also share, I'll often talk to parents about, you could even share, like, I went to this talk and it was about how a lot of us are missing out on things. And, it was really eye-opening to think about things that maybe I hadn't even considered, that maybe you think or you are experiencing on a daily basis. And these were some of the things they talked about. What do you think about that? Like, that's always a really easy way to do it. And, sometimes, you can just wonder out loud to find out you know, what may be happening, because girls are really good at correcting you when you're wrong. And so, you know, there's never any, I don't think there's any harm in just saying, oh, was that something that really bothered you? And they're like, no, that's great. That's good information. You can use it. I find that they will tell you based on the strength of the response. Like maybe it's not clearly linked, but you usually will know when you've hit a nerve in some way. And so you got to kind of follow that lead, not by interrogation, but just, you know, use your feelers to kind of know that, you know, the radar here, that I've linked on to something. I don't know what it is, but there's something going on with this. And over time, again, not all at once, not in a really intense kind of anxiety provoking way, but I find that teens will open up, but you just have to have the feelers. I find cars are a really great place to have conversations when you're not looking at each other. So, you know, just, you know, I think it's good to have on your radar. You don't have to probe too hard, but often, you know, you can just bring up things you've seen and things you've heard and see what kind of response you get. The second part to the question, I think, was how do we help them deal with that sadness? And, you know, I always talk about how, you know, when you've had a really hard day and you may be talking to a family member, a spouse, and you're complaining about something that's really hard. What do you want in that moment? Do you want your partner to tell you, you know, it's going to be fine, it's not that big a deal, or you should have dealt with it differently, or, you know, to remember the other good times you've ever had? No, that's not really helpful in that moment. You just want someone to listen to you. And sometimes we're not great at listening. How do we really listen to somebody? That is, I think, a really key thing in helping kids process really hard feelings. Provide feedback. Tell them what you just heard. I heard you say, I hear you say that this is really hard for you. You really miss this thing. Yeah, that must be so hard for you. And one of the things that I find parents will often do is they'll validate, oh yeah, that was really hard. And then they add a but. So, oh yeah, that was really hard. But, you know, you're going to be able to do this another time. Never use but. And I really think that because is a better response. So yeah, this was a really hard thing for you because, and you provide your understanding of why it may have been hard. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be right, but you are kind of feeding back to the teen, to the child, what you think you've understood. And then you add another because. And then you add a third because, 3 becauses. Because at that point, you have now shown the child, the teen, whether or not you're right, that you're really trying to get what they're saying to you. And that's what it is. And we have to sit in the mud. We have to sit with the because. We're not adding a but. We're not trying to fix it. We're not trying to come up with a solution to how to fill this loss or this gap in your life. We're just sitting with it. And often when that child feels listened to, they will themselves start to find ways to think about it differently. They may come up with some sort of solution. They may come up with some sort of problem. They may ask you a question like, do you think we could do this instead? And that is them coming to that sort of conclusion on their own. And that's a beautiful thing. And that's really, as parents, what you're hoping they can learn for themselves. How do I solve this problem for myself? How do I deal with this emotion for myself?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That idea of having to sit with the discomfort. Both, you know, you mentioned that from the perspective of the child, our daughters, our students, but also as parents, we have to be able to sit with that discomfort that it might take time for the girls to develop those skills, but that it's worth them having that opportunity. I'm going to try to link 2 questions here. There was a question about the balance between enabling and supporting. So kind of how do you manage that fine line between being supportive but not enabling? And I'm going to link that maybe to a practical situation where we have a question about, you know, encouraging our daughters and the girls to succeed. So, you know, how do we, without creating anxiety, I guess maybe let them know expectations for success, or that there is definitely real kind of pressure for success in some cases with grades, with the university applications. And then as a parent, are you, you know, how do you support or enable? How much do you push? I think is kind of the way that question is phrased.
Right. These are good. So support. And I guess the question for me, sometimes it's really helpful when I have, you know, an actual sort of like real world example to kind of give it, you know, to sort of frame things in two different ways. I think you have to sort of recognize, what is the end goal? Is the end goal, as a parent, am I trying to help my kid deal with how they're feeling right now? Or am I trying to help my kid really overcome this thing that they feel is getting in the way? So, you know, if it's about, if my kid is anxious because they're worried about a test, and, you know, enabling that anxiety might look like, um, you know, letting them stay home from school, or writing all the notes for them so that they have something to study. Now, if a kid had some learning needs, maybe helping them write the notes would be a great way to, you know, that's a really supportive thing to do. So it's a tough one. And so am I trying to solve the problem for them, or am I trying to help them recognize that they can deal with it? And so, you know, enabling the anxiety may sometimes look like fixing the problem in the short term, whereas supporting them through anxiety is really about, you know, maybe today is not going to be a success, but we're going to get through it together, and I'm going to show you that you can handle it by letting you deal with the discomfort that may come from, you know, not getting it right this time. So it's a really tricky one. If I think about, I wish I had, like, if someone wanted to give like an actual real world example without obviously identifying information, I might be able to explain it a little bit better. In terms of putting, I think the other question was around, how do we maintain expectations without putting undue pressure on the child? Is that sort of what the second question was? And I guess it's true. I guess, can you tell me the question again, the second question, what, and about the expectations?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the idea was around, the question was around the idea of there are real pressures in terms of performance, especially when it comes to the upper grades, as girls are worried about marks going off to university and university admissions and wanting to achieve. And there may be other forums or areas in their life, but the question was, I think, more around academic success. And so, you know, yeah, I think it's that push and pull between, as a parent, saying, yeah, that does matter. There's a reality out there where those things matter, but to not create anxiety around that reality. So I guess the idea of encouraging the success without the anxiety.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, because I almost feel like anxiety, okay, if we talk about anxiety and what anxiety is, it is sort of a natural, normal emotion that we experience when we feel like there's pressure. So you will feel some anxiety when there's any pressure to do anything, but it can be helpful. It can be helpful anxiety. Not all anxiety is bad. It motivates us. You know, if I didn't care about my presentation, if I wasn't a bit anxious about it, I probably wouldn't have put the time into it and revised it a bunch of times. So, you know, I think there's good anxiety out there, and it's protective, but it's also motivating. What becomes challenging is that when we start to notice that a young person or even an adult has a way of thinking about the world in such extreme terms that they don't know how to deal with anything that doesn't fall into one of two categories, that's more concerning. So I think you can be supportive of kids achieving to the best of their abilities while still emphasizing that success is not the only, success is not based on a certain rigid set of criteria. So obviously marks do matter, and marks matter to get into school. But at no point as a psychologist would I suggest that the marks matter more than the person's coping abilities. So we have to be able to both, I guess, support a young person's achievement goals and professional goals, while at the same time helping them cope with the potential for it not to always work out the way they want it to. And so how do you deal when things don't work out that well? And so you kind of have to put emphasis on both of those things.
I really like that. Thank you, Meredith. I think that really matches what we believe as a school as well, that you know, too much emphasis on a mark, on that, you know, a percent, versus thinking about the learning process or what has been achieved throughout the whole journey, the skills that have been developed, and the whole other holistic things that have been learned is so crucial. And I'm really glad you mentioned that. There's a parent who commented that they really liked the idea of not flicking the light switch, that's really got her thinking about some of her own routines, and that sometimes it seems that the really heavy conversations or emotional conversations come up at the wrong time. Maybe it's bedtime and you're actually kind of rolling into, you know, getting the kids settled and having some other things to do, like cleaning up the kitchen or, you know, getting to your own work or reading a book or something like that. So maybe what are some practical steps that could be taken in the moment to appropriately postpone a conversation if it isn't the right time? Or what would you suggest?
I mean, it can't always be, you can't always just sort of say, throw caution to the wind and say, yes, we're going to get down to business right now. Let's talk this through. Like, it just doesn't work that way. But I think, as you know, the key thing, I think, as a parent, is that you want the child to know that what they've mentioned isn't just going to be forgotten. So how can you convey to your child, knowing who your child is, how they work, how they think, that this isn't just going to be sort of pushed off and maybe we'll talk about it in the future, but maybe it will never get talked about again. So, you know, in the spur of the moment, if you feel like you can probably deal pretty well with it, I would take the opportunity to do it. If it feels like it's happening every single night, then you may need to kind of have a good plan for, like, it seems like some of these things are coming up at bedtime. Can we write some of these things down? And we're going to come back to them. Let's come back to them tomorrow at around 4:30. We'll have tea, we'll sit down, and I'll bring it up. I mean, bedtime is what we call like an attachment provoking time. So kids, teens even, will bring stuff up. We're emotionally vulnerable at that time. We're tired. We're, you know, highly emotional. So we tend to bring things up. So it is sometimes helpful to deal with them when they're coming up, because tomorrow it might not be a big deal anymore. But just, I guess, at minimum, do not minimize it. Don't say like, oh, you're fine, you know, get to bed. I think you have to give it some attention and you have to name it and acknowledge it. And then if it really doesn't seem like this is the right time, just really like look your child in the eyes and say, this seems really important, and I want to make sure that we talk about this more. I'm going to write it down if you think you need to write it down, or I'm going to remember that we need to talk about this tomorrow. And can I check in with you tomorrow about this? And you can let me know if it's a good time for you.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good idea. I can see that working. Again, very practical strategy there, and still validating that you want to have the conversation, but giving that, you know, kind of placeholder for it is a really good suggestion. We have time for one more question, and there is one that is waiting in the Q&A about the distinction between anxiety being either learnt or hereditary. So it seemed that it could be either, and that how can we pay attention as parents to our own cues, that we are able to kind of change our own narrative as the girls are growing and developing, to kind of account for maybe both of those pieces, that if it is hereditary, if it is something that they're learning, from their environment, how can we adjust our own cues? How can we pay attention to our own cues? What are things that we as parents should be noticing?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes things don't even pop up until the words come out of your mouth, or you realize, that you've been staring at your phone looking at COVID numbers for 30 minutes while your kids have been playing in the same room. So sometimes we're totally, completely blind to some of the things that we're doing that are just emphasizing, that anxiety piece. I think at the end of the day, if parents really feel like anxiety is something that maybe they've struggled with, didn't even know that that's really what it was, but now it's really resonating, or, they're finding that their child's experience of anxiety is bringing to light maybe some of the stuff that they may not have dealt with in the past. I always tell parents, like, that would be a really helpful thing for you to work on. It's very hard to try to fly the plane while you're building it. So if you yourself are experiencing anxiety, it's going to be really hard for you to help your kid do something that you maybe haven't always been so good at doing. So just how sometimes when we have anxiety in our own families, or we experience anxiety, we are the ones that want to remove it from our kids. So that can be a really helpful thing. So we're the ones that want to provide the reassurance. We're the ones that want to solve the problem. We're the ones that want to let things go, because we don't want to create more stress for our kid, because we can see that they're not handling it well. So those are the types of things to be really aware of. Am I being more easygoing about this because I know what this feels like? And if that's the case, we got to do something differently. On the flip side, sometimes some parents have anxiety, but they react very strongly to it in a negative way. So they're the minimizing ones. They sort of feel like, I can't deal with this. I have my own stuff going on. Please do not bother me with your emotional stuff right now, because I'm already keeping it together. So, that is a really important thing too. If we find that we can't deal with our own kids' anxiety, it feels too much for us. Our emotional backpack is already full, so we cannot take the burden of our child. We have to find ways to sort of unpack that a little bit for ourselves, so there's room to pick up on what our kid is experiencing. It makes me think of, a scenario where a parent was a teacher, and the daughter, was at the same school. This is not Elmwood. This is a totally other place. It's in another city. And the parent would check the teenage daughter's marks before the teenager got them back. And when the teenager would say, "Can you please not do that? Can you please not talk to my teachers and find out what my exam marks are?" He would say, "It's not a big deal. I just work at the school." And the teenager herself realized, if it was such a not a big deal, he wouldn't need to check. So his anxiety around his child's performance was requiring him to check the marks of his daughter before she could even get them. And then when she would come to him and say, "Dad, can you please stop doing that?" he acted like it wasn't a big deal. So that's the kind of scenario where working with the parent becomes really, really helpful, and recognizing that the biases that we hold, the anxieties we hold, we're sort of that messaging, how we do things, how we talk about them has such a significant impact on our young people. And so sometimes we need to do the work just as much as we think, our kids need to do the work. It's really just it's all within that family, and it's about identifying all these different variables that are contributing to the same difficulty.
Thank you so much. Really comprehensive answer. And I know a lot of people will find that helpful advice and those recommendations. I'm so thankful that we've had this time with you, Meredith. This has been such a treat and a gift to be able to learn from you and from your expertise. And you have such an open way of sharing and really kind of humanizing some of these issues that I think a lot of us are struggling with, and knowing how best to support our girls. I definitely feel really thankful that we've been able to have you kick off our speaker series and do it with such wonderful demeanor and openness. I apologize in advance if there were some questions that didn't get answered, but I feel like we got through so much in an hour and a half. And this has been a wonderful experience. And thank you so much for everything you've shared. We do have upcoming speaker series sessions. So as I said, Meredith has kicked off our series this evening and done it with an amazing amount of information and expertise. And so I'm hoping that the future speakers will be able to follow in her footsteps. Ms. Irwin-Jackson, Jennifer, I don't know if we have another slide that talks about the next event, just to let people know when that is. And so,
yeah.
Okay, so if
we will post that to Schoology. I will also say that we've recorded this session and we will be sharing that on Schoology. And there's also been a bit of a spontaneous organization of class parents to have a bit of a conversation after this, a book club, if you will, a webinar club, to have some discussion about some of the themes that we've talked about tonight. So look for all that information on Schoology.
Wonderful. So we'll post everything there.
Yep.
And thank you again to all the parents who joined us. We had such an amazing turnout. I think this definitely speaks to an interest in having an opportunity to learn from experts like Meredith about some of these issues and having all of these practical strategies to take away. So we do hope that the parents are able to continue to tune in for our future sessions. And thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. And thank you again, Meredith.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Have a good evening, everyone. Good night.
Thanks so much.